am I communicating? How am I getting across? And it's my responsibility. I love when coaches take responsibility for losses because they feel like they didn't convey the right message or they didn't reach a young person in the right manner. So I think learning how to communicate in a way that certain things push, you can push a kid their button a certain way, and then you can you know the technique that you use for one person may not work for the other person.
Like 60s funky worms with waves and perms, just sending junky rhythms right down your block. We beat to rap, what key beat to lock, but I'm cool like
Episode number 6 is with Dr. Michael Norwood, a personal trainer and sports performance psychologist based out of San Diego, California. My name is Eric Mojica, your host for the Can Chats podcast. Dr. Norwood earned his doctorate degree in performance psychology from the University of Kansas, where he also served as director of Peak Performance Clinic. After his time at KU, he's worked and operated his own businesses out of Las Vegas and San Diego, helping his clients with personal training and counseling across all age groups, athletes and non. In this episode, Dr. Norwood dives deep into performance psychology and how our methods of communication as coaches and trainers impact how individuals receive our instruction. Interactions with our clients and athletes play a pivotal role in establishing trust and developing a culture, ultimately taking leadership as a service rather than a title. We will also discuss what Dr. Norwood believes are the responsibilities and duties of a coach, being in a position that is so much more than writing X's and O's. Dr. Norwood and I have been co-teaching a kinesiology class at Avila University, discussing topics in motivation, learning, and communication skills that apply to almost any imaginable service in the field of kinesiology. If you're a personal trainer, sports coach, or simply just a leader in your workplace, you're going to love this show, and hopefully get some valuable information that you can apply to your everyday tasks and leadership. Don't forget to follow and subscribe to the show, which is available on YouTube, SoundCloud, and now the iTunes podcast app. You can also find our content on Facebook and Instagram, as well as our website at knchats.wordpress.com. More shares and ratings allow us to grow and share free content to listeners like you, ultimately growing the community with the passion and interest in health and fitness. So look no further and let's get this show rolling. Episode number 6 with Dr. Michael Norwood starts right now. All right, good morning, Dr. Norwood.
Good morning, Eric. How are you?
Doing well. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Awesome. So Dr. Norwood is out is it San Diego?
San Diego, yes.
San Diego, California. And so Dr. Norwood and myself, we've been co-teaching a class over at Avila University. A little bit different ways about going, and we have Dr. Norwood on Skype all the time, so this is not new to us. Yeah. But for our guests on the show, I kind of wanted to dive into sports psychology, and that's kind of your specialty. So if you want to just kind of get us started by just telling your story about what you do and where you came from.
Excellent. Well, my story started when I was a kid, actually, when it comes to sports psychology. One of the things, I grew up with some great coaches and had some great team experiences and individual experiences. And then as I ascended through high school, some of the coaches weren't very good. And I learned how much coaching played a part in performance. And so it always intrigued me to think more about the psychological aspect of sport, as because I thought it was a neglected part of what a lot of coaches, how they're coaching, they're not really addressing the mental aspects and how we perform as athletes. So I think when I started out, I had some great coaches, as I said, and then I ran across coaches that I didn't understand why they said to me what they said to me and how it affected my performance. And so I got my undergrad degree in psychology and philosophy because I kind of knew I was going to go in that direction. And then went to grad school and got my PhD in sports psychology from the University of Kansas. From there, I started working with a lot of athletes in our Peak Performance Clinic. And it was a huge need. We had all kinds of athletes, not only athletes, but students who would struggle with test taking, and just helping them to position themselves to be successful. And what are the key pillars and the key elements of those things. So I've, from an athlete standpoint, from a coaching standpoint, and now from a middle skills coach, it's been a fun evolution to help people perform at their best.
Awesome. And so when it comes to coaching, what do you think is like the biggest I don't want to say the problem, but what do you think coaches need to do more of nowadays?
Um, I think to really get to know the people that they're serving. I think changing that frame. I think as a coach, I think you're serving people as opposed to them just following you. That's a huge responsibility, and I think you have to fundamentally understand that you're serving these young men or young women to be better adults as they grow older because they're going to so you're teaching them how to navigate failure, you're teaching them how to navigate victory, so you're constantly teaching. You're a teacher and a mentor, and you're trying to. I think when you have to communicate better. So I think that's one of the best things that you can do is how am I communicating? How am I getting across? And it's my responsibility. I love when coaches take responsibility for losses because they feel like they didn't convey the right message or they didn't reach a young person in the right manner. So I think learning how to communicate in a way that certain things push, you can push a kid their button a certain way, and then you can, the technique that you use for one person may not work for the other person. And I think you have to be sensitive to that process. So I think it's a lot of coaches. In fact, my son had a basketball game. He plays high school basketball, and the coach for the other team, they didn't have a lot of depth. They didn't have a lot of talent. And I think the final score ended up being like 71 to, 28, something. But the coach on the other team, he yelled at these kids the whole time, and it was non-productive. So it was terrible communication. He didn't realize that, hey, I'm out, man. Maybe he did and didn't care, but he was more on stage for, I think, the people who were in the gym, as opposed to really, it was one of those coaches. I said, gosh, I would hate to play for this guy because I'd be afraid that, if I passed the ball out of bounds or if I dribbled out of bounds, he'd yell at me. And that's what he did the whole time. So psychology and how you communicate with people, they have physiological consequences. So the last thing you want to do as an athlete is play tight. And so when you have a coach who is constantly harping on what you're doing wrong, whether it's in the game or in practice, you don't free them up physiologically to play well, to be themselves, really.
And so can you dive deeper into communication? And so, like, what are the key components that a coach needs to understand about communication?
Well, first of all, I think we have to understand with communication, and I wish everyone knew this, that you only hear about 7% of content. Like what you tell a person, they're only getting about 7% of it through what you're actually saying, the words that you're using. And then about 55% is nonverbal. 55% of if you have your arms crossed on the sideline and you're stoic and you're not saying a word, well, you're communicating to your team. Or, 18% is tonality. Do you yell? Do you whisper? How do you communicate? So I think understanding those elements of how communication is conveyed is very important with how you communicate with your team or your individual athlete. One of the things that I think is really important is to praise in front of the whole team and to critique, serious critiques individually. And when you critique someone, I think it's important to tell them in a manner that is not personal, where people can personalize things. It's just performance based. I'd like for you to do this. This is what you're doing now, and this is what we're going to work on in practice. And so you're creating the environment where people feel free to be who they are. And when people are free to be who they are, they're going to play to their highest levels. I think one of the best coaches right now that does that very thing is probably like a Steve Kerr for Golden State. I think he allows his players to be who they are, but there's a fundamental way that they do things at Golden State, which is really cool to watch. I think he's probably a great model for that. And he takes when they went on their losing streak, he took a lot of responsibility for that. So it's once again taking responsibility for how your players perform. And obviously, you want them to take responsibility for their performance and what they can control, but you as a coach has to do the same thing. I've seen far too many coaches blame and shame, and they think that's, I think it's probably a masculinity thing as well. I think, sports is so tough, especially like the, football, baseball. You got to be kind of gritty to play certain sports. And so with that comes a certain element of machismo. And so you communicate in a way that doesn't necessarily resonate with everybody. Some people it might resonate, but making sure that you understand that people receive communication differently. Yeah.
And that seems to be the challenge with everything, right? Whether if you're a teacher, if you're a coach, personal trainer, like the way that you communicate is huge. And in my experiences, I feel like, yeah, understanding the person, getting to know their personality plays a huge role, because then you can understand, what makes them tick, what doesn't, what gets them to understand the message you're trying to get across, what gets them to kind of like resent you, ignore you, things like that. So
Absolutely. And to
when,
follow up, to piggyback up on that real quick, Eric, I think the thing I, I've worked with hundreds of coaches, and I think one of the things that resonates with the better coaches is no matter what their communication style is, if your team or your athlete that you're working with knows that it comes from a place of love, and I know that sounds foo-foo kind of, but if it comes from a place of honesty and integrity, and that I'm really for you and your advancement, and not just for me wearing that moniker of being the coach. I'm really in this for us. I want you to succeed. If it comes from that, I think communication is a lot easier. Trust. If you don't communicate in a way that conveys trust, I think you've lost before you even begun the game. I think it's important to come when people, and I hate to call out names of people who do it poorly, but there are some people that I've seen in the in the media that do it really poorly. They want something out of their players, but they themselves aren't willing to give that to their players. The whole, the loyalty, that's another thing you see, especially in big time athletics like NCAA or professional. The coach will say, I need and demand your loyalty, but they don't necessarily give that in return. And so people see through that kind of stuff. And I think if you're disingenuous with how you communicate, it's going to impact not only that one athlete, but it's going to impact everybody. So I think honesty and integrity and coming from a place of I'm really for my team makes all the difference in the world. And if you're not doing that right now, you need to check yourself and ask yourself whether or not you should be a coach and influencing people. Gosh, I mean, because there's so many lessons to be learned. And good coaches teach the great lessons, I think.
And so when it comes to creating a good environment, a good team culture, but from my perspective, I feel like, one, you have to understand your coach, right? You need to understand what you're good at, what you need to be better at, and so forth. But then there's also the element of the team and understanding individual personalities. And so what can you tell us about personality types and how that may affect the way that you need to approach coaching, as far as how you communicate individually to groups, the whole team in general? So you kind of dive into that.
Sure. I think it's, it depends on what measure you're using. I don't know that a lot of coaches will use different instruments to test different types of personalities, but I think it's important to understand who's the quiet guy. There's quiet leaders, there's vocal leaders, there's people who BS. They're not very, they say one thing, but they don't really do what they say they're doing. And, you see right through all those things. But I getting back to making sure get to know your athletes, get to know them, get to know who their parents are, who their siblings are, what they like to do outside of, sports. What's up? Do they play Fortnite? Do they play, what do they do? Get to know who they are. What books do they like to read? Who's their favorite singer? So I think if you understand people within their context, because we all have different contexts, then you can address them in a way that is amenable to them. I like, and people receive communication differently. And I look at this being married, giving and receiving love. I know for me, when my wife cooks dinner, she's showing me how she loves me. And that doesn't mean that if she doesn't cook dinner, she doesn't love me, but I love those things. So some people, you have to say, I love you, in order for them to feel that you love them. And some people you have to show them through different things in order to feel that same thing. So once again, I think it's important to understand that you understand who you're talking to, because you've created a relationship with them, a true relationship. I don't know the coaches that are listening to us not on right now, how busy they are, or if they're higher level coaches. It doesn't really matter. You got to take the time, invest the time in every single person that you're working with. So, because trust is the foundation. If you can get people to trust in you and in your vision and what the team goals are, they're going to run through walls for you. But you have to break down those personalities by getting to know who they are.
And so when it comes to personality types, like what are the different types? And you kind of dive into that a little bit.
Well, it doesn't. I mean, are you talking about what? Like I said, there's different um, batteries that we use. I don't use any different assessments, psychological assessments.
Mm-hmm.
I per se don't use those in my practice, but some
Right.
people do. So MMPI, I think, is one of the instruments that people use to see whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, or
Right.
you're intuitive, or those are different types of batteries. I haven't. Many years ago, we used to use that, but I haven't used it for a long time. So it's something that I can't really speak to. But what I will say is that the way to get to know, one of the reasons I don't like to use personality types per se, I like to use things like, what are your tendencies? Like, do you withdraw more, or when you have a problem, do you seek help? Do you? So understanding what people's context is what I try to do by getting to know them. And I try to get coaches to know their players, their athletes a little bit better than they do. And that doesn't, one of the mistakes that I see with coaches is that they try to speak differently to different people. I think if you're consistent in your communication, meaning I only know one gear in terms of speaking with people. I just know how to be me. That's all I know. I can't assume that I could speak like someone who comes from a rural environment or an inner city environment or higher socioeconomic environment. I can't. All I know is all I can give you, and I can just be me using my own tonality, the words that I use. So I think it's important, if you're tapping into personalities, is not using some battery or some assessment tool. I think it's important. The assessment tool is spending the time in your office, on the field, and learning how people take your messages and how you receive their messages. Because I often see, when I worked at the University of Kansas, I would see people who were withdrawn. They were more withdrawn. That was just who they were. And coaches would look at that and say, well, that kid's disinterested, or he's not putting forth effort. That's just who that kid is. It's important for the coach. It's the coach's job to reach out to that kid and spend some extra time to pull out what they want to pull out from that individual. And to further that statement, I think it's important to help that person understand how they come off as aloof or disinterested in what you're saying. So it's important for that coach to really reach into that kid or that person and say, let me pull out your best. I want to pull out your best, because something tells me you sitting or being by yourself and isolating yourself and being withdrawn is not your best. And we need more from you. And once again, it comes from a place of love. We need more from you. In order for us to elevate as a team, we need more from you. And you being quiet doesn't serve us, and it doesn't serve you. So you can't go to work. To me, this is what we're teaching kids. You can't go to work and be withdrawn and do your job and do 100% work, productivity. You have to be able to deliver. And so I think you're teaching kids how to do that.
Right on.
Does that make sense in terms of, I hope I didn't, once again, the personality assessment that you need to use is the time. Invest in the time in the person and really get to know that person, because that's not going to show up on some type of personality assessment. So, yeah.
Yeah. So like just kind of like starting off in school, when I was under my undergrad, and some of the basic stuff that you go through books is just, okay, well, there's introverts and extroverts, kind of like you talked about in there. And so I personally have not been able to understand that until I've experienced it as a coach, because as a player, when I was playing college baseball at Avila, like I noticed there was the one kid who he had behavioral problems, right? And the one that had the attitude, the one that never cared and always showed up late. And so there's all these different personality types. And I understood how they came off to other teammates, how, they didn't care, or they were just me guys, only there for themselves. But then as a teammate, getting to know them a little more, I just realized, you know what, that's just how he is. But it's not like he wants to destroy the team and whatnot.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And I think it's the coach's role, Eric, if I can, to put that mirror up to that kid and say, this is how other people perceive you. This is what we need from you. Can you do it? I'm going to help you do it. And really say, this is what just focus on one thing at practice. Go give someone a high five. I want you to go give Eric a high five. Just just helping them come out of their shell. If that, I mean, I keep referring to this withdrawn thing, or someone who calls somebody out all the time. Well, that might work or it may not work. And so I think it's important for the team, the coach, to manage those personalities by investing in time and talking about those things. And so it's the coach's responsibility at the end of the day to get to know these players so you can help them communicate better so you elevate the whole group.
Right on.
Yeah.
And so when it comes to motivation, how do you define motivation? Because I feel like there's so many different ways to motivate somebody, and there's effective ways, and I think there's ineffective ways. So what is motivation to you?
Motivation for me is having the requisite energy to pursue the requisite outcome or the desired outcome. So it's a sustenance or sustaining energy to get to your outcome. And so, like you said, there's so many different ways to do it. A lot of coaches, I think screaming the message is the way to motivate people. And I think it can work. I think it has worked in the past, but I don't think it's sustainable. That's the problem. I don't think you can sustain that yelling. You can't just keep pounding that. And there has to be something more profound than that. So I think how to motivate people is to come from the heart, is to focus on the details, and to be clear in the vision. And have it, to the extent that you can do that, I think people are going to be motivated. And celebrating small victories. Some people are so demanding, some coaches are so demanding that they forget the small things that, you know, someone might make a breakthrough, but you don't celebrate that. And so they're going to, kids or, you know, athletes, we're all human. We're going to say, well, I keep doing this, I keep improving, but no one's giving me any credit for it. And so at some point, you're going to feel like, what's the point of this anyway? So I think it's important from a motivational standpoint, is what you're doing working? Meaning that not winning, but is everyone having a great time? Is everyone, are they rallying around a specific vision or a specific aim or a specific goal? And if they're not, then there's something wrong. We didn't clearly define what our mission is as a team. And I think you have to start with mission, and then what are we going to do at practice every day to get towards that mission? And the coaches that I see that clearly define that, motivation kind of takes care of itself. And it's not about championships. It really is about one step at a time towards excellence. If we can work on excellence and you can invest in people to work on their own personal excellence, then all of a sudden the team elevates together. And you're only as strong as the guy at the end of the bench, quite honestly. I've watched, this is what I do for a living, so I watch teams. And the guy who doesn't play at all could really contaminate the whole team. So it's important for the coach. I always leave it on the response, because they're the adults in the room. They're the ones that should be a little bit more versed, a little bit more well-rounded, that are going to help extract what people are struggling, you know, how their team is struggling. So you got to go reach that guy at the end of the bench and help him succeed. And if you can help that person succeed or her succeed, then I think everyone else will fall in line. Yeah, I think that's really important to understand that you're not just talking to the stars and motivating them. You're talking to everybody on that team and reaching them and telling them what their value is to the team.
Right. Yeah. And as a baseball coach of a 14-year team, I try to do the same thing, to where
Excellent.
I had 14 players on the roster this past fall. And so for a youth baseball team, that's a lot. And so we got 9 kids on the field, and then we got the rest of them all sitting in the bench right there. And naturally, right, because I've been through it too, you want to be out on the field, and being on the bench doesn't feel good. And we did have some really good players that have never been on the bench. And so I really tried to take that opportunity to sit down with them in the middle of the inning, even if it's just like a 2-sentence conversation, and just saying, hey, man, like, you're not getting punished here. Like, we're working as a team, what we're doing. Try to convey the message in there. And so kind of like just piggybacking on what I said earlier about how it hasn't been until I've experienced coaching that I understand now a little bit more of, you know, how important that little thing is, just to communicate a quick little message.
Absolutely. Because you have to show that you care. If they don't think you care, then they're going to assume, and you know what happens when we all assume, that they're not good enough and somebody's playing in front of them and you're not paying attention to them. You have to constantly preach what you're trying to do, what we're trying to do as a team, and not only preach what you're trying to do, but like you did, you should put your arm around the kid and say, hey, man, you're not being punished. We're just, this is a team. And we have to learn how to be a part of a team. And sometimes you're going to be the superstar and sometimes you're going to be sitting on the middle of the bench. And that's okay. How are you going to be a better teammate so that we play better and perform better as a team?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think enough coaches do that, by the way, Eric.
Yeah. And also as a player and as a coach, I also just notice how a coach can easily lose credibility when you lose that trust within the player. And so I think that's something that's really important for coaches to always try to maintain, because if you lose that trust, your words really lose that power and that meaning.
If I can ask you a question real quick, Eric, for TU, how do you deal with the parents of that kid who used to play all the time? Because I'm sure you probably have parents in your ear about, my son, he did this, did that. Now he's not playing. What's going on?
So I try to constantly communicate with emails. And so during the season, maybe 2 or 3 times a week, I'm sending out emails, whether if it's just an update on a workout or if it's an update what we're going to do next practice. But I try to always leave that line of communication open. And so I haven't had too many encounters personally, at least not yet. But I try to leave that door open so that way at the end of practice, at the end of the game, like my door's open right there. You're welcome to come in and ask some questions.
Excellent.
So even though I have had some parents kind of ask some questions about playing time and whatnot, I've never really encountered it to be a very aggressive, like, why is my kid not playing kind of tone to it. So
sure.
I think that I've been successful with that. And so that's kind of been my approach. Yeah.
Do you set the expectation on the front end? Because I think a lot of coaches could benefit from setting the expectation. And also, if you set that expectation, make sure that you live that expectation, that you literally follow through on it. Because I've heard people set the expectation, but they really didn't follow through. And there goes your credibility. There goes your trust. If you're not walking the walk and walking the talk, you're lost. You'll lose. Even if you lose one person, everybody else is going to say so-and-so's not happy. That gives me a license not to be unhappy about whatever other little thing that happens. So it's important that I love that you said I communicate. You keep the lines of communication open. I don't think you can over communicate. I think it's important to say, hey, Johnny's improving here. This is what we're working on, and this is how we're doing it. And I think if you can, and also I think sport to me should reflect reality. Like, you're not going to get every job that you apply for. You're not going to get into every college that you apply for. It's competitive. Right. And maybe you got a kid on the team that's on a roll. He's just hitting the ball like it's nothing. And you got to keep that kid in there because he's hitting the ball he's in a groove. So how do you, the guy who's playing behind him, how do you make him support the kid that's in front of him? And you have to create that energy as a coach. Mm-hmm. That environment, you're setting the table for what happens. You're responsible for it.
And so that kind of reminds me, because we had a class discussion. I think it's one of the first ones that we had when we were teaching that class at Avila, the whole subject of participation trophies. And so I was hoping if you kind of go into that conversation a little bit and talk about the segment we talked about with parents, right? How parents can get more aggressive and arguing with umpires and or referees and players themselves. And so going into arguing with officials from all ends of the spectrum, what's your take on what's going on with sports nowadays?
I think people, and I think this has always kind of been the case, but with, everyone who owns a cell phone can be a journalist because you have your, recording device and your camera. I think when you're from the parent's perspective, well, first of all, referees, officials, they're human. And oftentimes, especially you're coaching 14U baseball, those guys, those folks that are umpiring those games, number one, they're not making a lot of money. Number two, they're doing it because they love baseball and they want to be around it. And number three, they have feelings just like anybody else. So I think as a player and a coach and a parent, I think you should respect them as human beings first and foremost. And that you have to assume that they're doing the best they can with what they got where they are. And some people are really good. My son's last basketball game, those refs were amazing. They were amazing. And what I do as a parent, after a game, I find them and tell them what a great job they've done.
Mm-hmm.
The game before that, those refs were awful. they were terrible. But as a parent, I can't, I'm in the stands enjoying the game. So it's important to understand your role and to be a role model for your kid. One of the things I'm cognizant of when I'm driving home after football, basketball game, whatever with my kids, is making sure that I don't blame the coach or blame another player or blame the referee for why they lost. That's, to me, it's the worst thing you could do, because you want your kids, either as a parent or a coach, to take ultimate responsibility for their performance. And that sometimes you fall short, and that's okay, because that's life. If you're not teaching life lessons through sport, then you probably should do something else. And so I think it's important to understand you got to, the referee, if a referee makes a bad call, you could smile and pat the ref and nudge him a little bit. He knows, or she knows, she made a bad call. I think as a coach, the more you harp on the refs, I think they're going to go the other way on you. I mean, you might get a call here and there because they're afraid of you, or afraid that, I don't know why they're afraid of you, but there's some type of, they feel like they're under the microscope. But I think it's important just to treat them like human beings. And I think you'll go much further than yelling at them and screaming at them and cursing at them. I personally can't stand it, to watch it, because it doesn't move the needle forward. And especially if we're talking about 14U or high school, when you harp on a coach or a referee and ride them, I think it's a terrible example for the kids that you're supposed to be mentoring and leading.
Yeah, and I feel like that's also part of the nature of sport, right? I mean, it's competitive, and we want to win, and we want our team to win. We want our son to succeed and be a winner. And so I feel like a lot of the times when you do have those parents that get aggressive, or they like to argue, or they're trying to be very vocal to try to affect the game, I think it's just a huge emotion and passion that is in them, and they just don't understand how to express that properly.
Properly, absolutely. So as a coach, maybe, I think if you're a coach, one of the things that you can do is say talk to your parents and say, this is how we conduct ourselves. And that's it. You're not going to tolerate a parent jumping on a referee or umpire. We don't do that. That's not how we do things. And to follow up with that, you as a coach have to make sure when you have a disagreement with an umpire, that you can pull them aside and talk to them. You don't have to yell at him and kick dirt, kick right. Dirt on him and curse him out and talk about his mother. But I think it's important to behave yourself or conduct yourself with class. One of the things I see is coaches demand class out of their players, but they act classless. That's incongruent. And once again, there goes your integrity and your trust, and you lose credibility. If you tell your players to act a certain way and you act polar opposite to what you're demanding, you've lost your credibility. You're not congruent with your message and your actions. And we sniff that out. Human beings sniff that out so fast, especially kids. They'll call you out on it by not performing, by withdrawing, by isolating, because they just don't want to be a part of it. I've actually seen that, where their coaches go crazy. They run onto the field and yell at the ref or the ump, and the players they're kind of done. The game's over in their head, because this is a spectacle as opposed to competition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so when it comes to, I want to keep the subject a little bit about behavioral stuff, but punishment and reinforcement. I've kind of dived into a little bit of that, listening to a lot of podcasts. And so I grew up with some coaches who, I think for the most part, the ones that I had were very passive. So punishment was never really something that I went through as a player, in terms of whether as a team or myself doing something wrong. But I feel like whenever I did have somebody who was more of the punishment type, the yelling coach, the more aggressive type, I never really wanted to play for that type of coach. And I think as I got older, I started to appreciate that a little more, because I felt like it displayed more passion. And so what do you think is the most positive? Because I know that there's not just one, but punishment and reinforcement, how do you go about that when it comes to coaching athletes?
I don't think, I think there needs to be consequences. I don't think there needs to be quote unquote punishment. Punishment is punitive. And it's almost, if you use that as your, it's not very, it depends on what's going on, obviously. But I think on the front end, as a coach, one of the first things that you need to do is decide on what your non-negotiables are. Are you going to allow people to be late for practice? Are you going to allow people to be late for games? What kind of behavior are you going to tolerate in practice? Just those, what are those? And then what are the consequences of those things? It might be that you sit out. I guess that's a form of punishment. Reinforcement, positive reinforcement is giving them a pizza party after the game because they played so well. That's positives. And then there's negative reinforcement. It's taking something away to decrease the incidence of it or the chances of it happening again. So if they played poorly, you're taking something away from them. Maybe, I don't know what the privilege would be, but I guess you could take away a pizza party, for example, that they had scheduled already. See, I don't believe in, that's reinforcement, positive and negative reinforcement. The positive is that you're giving something to increase the likelihood of it happening again. Negative is taking away something to decrease that likelihood of it happening again. So I think it's consistency that's most important, and not to confuse intensity with punishment. And so if you're, there's Pete Carroll, I saw a piece on USC when he was there, but he embedded competition into everything. Everything was competitive. Every drill, no matter if it was 3 minutes or 5 minutes, you were competing against your teammate. And so they understood how to compete, and there was no punishment involved or any type. The reinforcement was, we're going to compete. That's the reinforcement. So how do you structure your practices to keep the intensity way high? So I like the players to be responsible for each other. So you're creating a culture where your players are kind of calling each other out on, hey, we don't do that here. We have a level of excellence that's way up here, and we don't tolerate that here in our program, because we can't get to where we're going if you got some guy acting like a knucklehead. So it's just important to kind of, another thing that I don't like to do is to use, I was at a basketball game once and the team lost. And so after they lost, the coach stood in the center court and their players did over 100 burpees in front of everybody. And I'm thinking, that's crazy. I mean, that to me is crazy. So I don't like to use, to me, your burpee is your ally. Your wind sprints are your allies. Lifting weights is your ally. Although your push-ups are your ally. So why are you going to demonize or bastardize your ally? You don't want to do that. So I think it's just something as simple as, when a player does X, this is the consequence. And that is spelled out in the beginning. And there's no fudge. I don't care if you're the superstar or the guy at the end of the bench. If you do X, this is the consequence. And so I think clarity is king. Being clear on the front end, and then making sure the players are responsible for each other, that we don't do that. That's kind of how it has to go. One of my sons is a really gifted athlete, and we were doing some training together with a group of kids, and he was just kind of going through the motions. And I just asked him to sit out. I didn't make a spectacle. I said, hey, doesn't look like you're ready right now. Just sit out. And when you're ready, jump right back in. But I need the energy to be at 10, not at 3. And you're at 3 right now. And so being kind of demonstrative in terms of, so they can visualize what that means. You're expecting an 8 to 10 intensity and you're giving me 3. That'll never work. It won't work in practice. It won't work in the game. So why are we going to practice that and reinforce that? So one of the things I think coaches could really do is to say, I need 8 effort or 10 effort. Or, hey, you're giving me 10 effort. I need to take it down to an 8 because you're over pursuing or you're working too hard. So teaching players how to kind of self-manage, and then you don't really have to coach during the game. But in practice, if you can teach them how to self-manage and know what their intensity level should be, there's no really time to be punitive. You don't have to punish. I see so many. When I was a kid, there was a guy who had he called it the reinforcer. It was a big paddle with holes in it. And when the kids made a mistake, he'd have them touch their toes and he'd smack them. And so obviously that would never fly. But when you're thinking about negative reinforcement or positive reinforcement, wow, that was the extreme of that. And they weren't very good. So that to me doesn't work. And you can't sustain that. It just doesn't work. People respond more to positive reinforcement than they do negative reinforcement.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that, something that I've recently have come across on is understanding that as a coach, that sometimes rules aren't as effective as values, because when you place values, the whole team it's just the perception of what that value is. Everyone knows that they have to follow it together, as opposed to a rule. The old saying, rules are sometimes meant to be broken. And
Absolutely.
so,
That's well stated, Eric. I think that's awesome to have as a leader in any organization, as a coach, as a leader of the team, to have value and to understand, to have, a certain list of values, the top 3 values of your team, and have everyone understand what that means. You're absolutely right. Values are more intrinsic. Rules to me are more extrinsic, and rules will be broken, but your values, if you value unity, for example, and you can see whether you have a unified team or you don't have a unified team, then how are you going to pull those kids together, those athletes together, so you do actually live unity? So I totally agree. Values are very important, along with your mission.
Yeah, awesome. And so, closing thoughts. What other advice do you have for coaches out there, for any trainers, people working with 14-year-olds, whether they're high school, college? What's your number one piece of advice that you can give to any coach out there?
Wow, I have so much advice, but I think that constantly, to adhere or to follow podcasts like yourself, because you're always digging and reaching and striving to be better. So constantly getting your nose in books, educate yourself, get around coaches that are great, model excellence. Look at the coaches that you admire and respect, and why do you admire and respect them? So I think modeling excellence, getting to know your players, the people that you serve, kind of turning that on their head. They're not there for you. You're there for them at the end of the day, making sure your context is proper. But yeah, I think it's really important to educate yourself and keep educating yourself, because it's always growth. And the more you grow, the more your team grows. If you're stagnant and if you're coaching the way you've been coached and it's not very good, you need more tools in your toolbox. And you need to sharpen those tools a little bit better. So I think it's constantly learning, constantly growing, and your team will grow to the extent that you will.
That's awesome. All right, Dr. Norwood. Well, thank you for your time, and I'll talk to you soon.
Eric, my pleasure, man. Keep up the great work.
All right, man. Have a good one.
You too. Take care.
And there it is, episode number 6. If you're a coach, trainer, or leader of a team, you can contact Dr. Norwood with any follow-up questions. You can email him at peakperformancepro@protonmail.com. Coaching is an art that goes beyond the instruction of skill and sport, much of what takes a lot of time and dedication to become a great leader. If you're a coach, taking the time to get to know your team and players can go a long way, helping build a culture that goes beyond the wins and losses record. If you're a personal trainer working in more of an individualized setting, building a relationship with your client can be the difference maker in helping them achieve their long-term success. Building trust is arguably the most important quality of a leader, putting you in a better position to give advice and getting the most out of the person whom you're working with. Leaders come in all sorts of ways, and the best know how to communicate and motivate those around them. If you're an athlete on a team, ask yourself, how well do you know the people around you? If you're a trainer and coach, do you know each individual's interests? What kind of challenges have they overcome or may be going through? What makes them tick and what drives their determination to improve their performance? On our next show, our guest will be Randy Holloway, a professional in the health and fitness industry with expertise in respiratory therapy and personal training. Once again, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this podcast with your friends and family to make the show more accessible to those interested in learning about the human body and exercise activity. Kinesiology is a discipline that covers a broad spectrum that goes beyond exercise and fitness. Our mission with KN Chats is to share the stories of professionals across the entire board, educating students, trainers, coaches, and anyone proactive with their personal health and fitness goals. Once again, thank you for listening to the show, and follow us on our website at knchatspodcast.wordpress.com. Our content is available on YouTube, SoundCloud, and now the iTunes Apple Podcasts app, bringing professionals to your living room or in the car as you're on the go. We have more shows coming your way, so stay tuned. This is Eric Mojica signing off. Until next time, This is KN Chats.